The morning was cold and gray, and the barracks seemed to stretch endlessly. The men moved through their routines quietly, avoiding the eyes of the guards. But inside the walls of their minds, the world was alive with whispers, rumors, and memories of home. Dieter sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the thin light creeping through the cracks in the wood. He thought of the letters that had arrived months ago, each one folded, carefully addressed to someone he knew or someone he had once commanded. Each one a fragment of hope wrapped in the ordinary words of survival. Across the camp, Carl and Hans spoke quietly in the corner of the mess hall, their voices low yet insistent about the future that might be theirs if the war had left them any choice about what to become. They spoke in codes known only to themselves, phrases taken from the letters transformed into maps and ideas, a silent rebellion of thought. The men around them listened, though not all believed in what was possible. Some clung to old pride, to memories of rank and order, refusing to allow themselves to hope for a Germany rebuilt on anything other than fear and obedience. Dieter moved through the barracks and into the yard. He watched the frost covering the ground, glinting in the weak sun, and saw the men walking in lines, their heads bowed to the cold or to the memories that weighed heavier than the snow on their shoulders. He felt the urge to speak to them, to tell them what he had learned from the letters, from Carl, from the whispers that spread faster than rumor, and yet he hesitated because he did not know if words alone could save them, if hope alone could survive in a place built on fear. The letters became his obsession. He read and reread every word, searching for meaning hidden beneath the mundane greetings and the mentions of ration lines of work, details that seemed to hide in plain sight, the coordinates of forests, the names of villages, safe houses, coded phrases that might direct someone home or warn someone away. He traced each line with his finger, imagining the map that lay invisible across the countryside, imagining the hands that had written them, trembling with both fear and determination. In the evenings, the barracks glowed dimly with the light from stoves and lanterns, and men gathered in small groups, murmuring about what they had seen, what they had survived, and what they hoped to become. Dieter joined them cautiously. He listened to the stories of destruction and loss, of families scattered across Europe, of villages burned and homes taken, and yet also of gardens planted secretly, of children kept alive against impossible odds, of secret acts of defiance, small and hidden and yet mighty in their courage. Carl spoke often of a Germany that would remember what had happened, not to punish, but to learn, a Germany that would rebuild from ashes, with hands guided by conscience, not by orders given blindly. Dieter found himself drawn to Carl's words, and yet also wary of the danger of speaking too loudly. The guards were not oblivious, and rumor traveled faster than footsteps. If someone overheard what was said, there could be consequences, not for those with power, but for those who dared to imagine a future free of fear. The nights were the hardest for Dieter. He lay on his bunk, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to the snoring and coughing of the men around him, imagining the world beyond the fences, the frost on the trees, the towns destroyed, yet still standing, waiting for someone to return to them, waiting for someone to write the next letter. And he began to write again, tracing the coordinates of forests, hidden routes, the names of men who could not speak aloud, the letters that would become maps not of battle, but of survival and memory. One evening a rumor spread that Hans had been overheard by a guard speaking of the future, and of a Germany that might rise from its own ashes. Dieter felt the weight of the world press down on him. The barracks seemed smaller, colder, more suffocating as the men whispered in corners about what it might mean if the guard repeated what he had heard, and the camp authority investigated more than words he imagined, searches, interrogations, punishments. Yet even in fear, the letters called to him, urging him forward, urging the men to imagine that even under watchful eyes, hope could still grow. The wind carried snow across the yard, and Dieter followed the footprints of men who had walked here before. He imagined them stepping across frozen fields, leaving invisible messages behind, messages only readable by those who could understand the codes of survival of life, hidden in letters not written to command, but to preserve memory. He traced the lines in the snow with his boots, as if the earth itself were a letter waiting to be read and understood, and he shivered with the thought that someone might be watching unseen, yet bound to the same codes. Inside the barracks, Elise, a nurse from a nearby village, arrived quietly with small scraps of paper and whispers she had heard about the coded letters, and risked herself to bring small messages from families that had survived the bombings, that had hidden their children, that had kept alive the memory of the men held in the camp. She handed the notes to Dieter, who read them carefully, every word, a heartbeat of hope, every fold, a sign that memory could not be erased, even when the war had tried to strip them of identity and home. Days passed slowly, and the men became experts in silence and observation. Each movement of a guard noted, each sound analyzed for meaning, every letter read in secret and memorized for safety. Dieter walked among them, sometimes offering a small phrase of encouragement, sometimes only listening and letting the ideas sink into the men's minds quietly, like seeds planted in frozen soil, yet growing slowly under the frost, until the spring of thought could take root one afternoon. Carl fell ill, and Dieter sat by his bunk, holding the letters that Carl had once clutched, giving small readings aloud, pretending the words were prayers and spells to preserve courage among the men gathered in silence. They listened, not knowing whether the words were truth or hope or both, yet they held them as if the letters themselves were alive, protecting them from despair. And Dieter understood that the network of words had become stronger than fear, stronger than hunger, stronger than the cold, that cut through the barracks like knives. Night fell again, and the wind howled across the camp, sending the shadows of the fences dancing across walls. Dieter and Elise moved quietly between bunks, passing letters that contained nothing obvious to the untrained eye, yet maps of survival and coded messages of resistance. They spoke softly about the villages beyond the hills, about the men who had survived the bombings, about the children who had remembered fathers they had never seen yet who lived. In the memory of these letters, and he realized that each envelope carried more than words. It carried the pulse of a nation waiting to rise. By the following week, the men had begun meeting in secret corners, corners that the guards assumed empty, yet were alive with whispered plans for the future of a Germany rebuilt without hatred and without blind obedience. Dieter traced letters on the floor of the barracks, showing hidden meanings. The men learned to read them silently, following the sequence of words like a map. They began to speak in codes that only they could understand, preserving the network that had kept hope alive. One evening the camp was restless. A rumor had spread that a new officer had arrived, a man who might be sympathetic to their plans, or a spy who could unravel everything. The men waited tense, listening for footsteps that did not arrive yet. The fear itself made them alert. Each shadow a potential threat, each whisper a warning. The letters became their guide more than ever. Each phrase memorized, each repeated word a safeguard against discovery, and the night stretched long as if time itself was holding its breath. Dieter thought of home. He thought of the destroyed cities of Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, of the forests burned, and of children who would grow up without fathers. He thought of the letters and the code, and he understood that survival was no longer only about hiding from guards. It was about preserving the memory of a nation and giving voice to those who could no longer speak, their lives etched in every word and every line. And he shivered, imagining the moment when the letters would finally reach those who waited, and whether they would understand or fear. The dawn arrived, cold and pale over the camp, sending thin rays of light through frost-covered windows. The men moved quietly, their routines unchanged, yet transformed inside by the invisible maps of words they held each step forward, guided by memory and hope. Dieter stood by the fence, watching the horizon, and wondered who would be the first to deliver a letter beyond the camp, and whether the network would survive the scrutiny of the world beyond the barbed wire and the walls. And he realized that every heartbeat in the barracks was now synchronized with the letters, and that silence itself had become a language. And as the morning stretched, the men gathered near the stove, their faces pale, but determined. Dieter held the letters close to his chest. He looked around at the men who had once been enemies, now bound by hope, and whispered that the future belonged not to those who commanded, but to those who remembered. And the wind carried a faint echo of voices from other camps, other forests, and other villages. And Dieter knew that this was only the beginning, and that the letters would carry them further than they could imagine, leaving every step heavy with suspense and the pulse of what was yet to come. The morning broke pale and brittle over the camp, the frost clinging to the fences and the barracks like a reminder of the months past without freedom. Dieter moved through the yard, each step careful, as if the earth itself might record his presence. The letters pressed against his chest, alive with the stories of men who had survived battles, who had hidden children, who had written in codes that no one outside could understand, yet carried truths that could change lives and shape the future across the barracks. Carl whispered to a small group of men, teaching them how to read the hidden sequences of words, how to understand the pauses and the phrasing as more than language, but as a map, a guide, a lifeline beyond the barbed wire, beyond the walls of the camp. Every letter, a fragment of possibility, every envelope, a pulse of courage that demanded attention and discipline. The men listened silently, tracing patterns with their fingers on the wooden floors and walls, imagining the paths that led to villages and forests hidden from any guard's knowledge. Dieter walked past Hans, who stood silently in the shadow of a post, his eyes cold yet thoughtful. The former major still clung to pride and memory, but Dieter sensed that even Hans was drawn to the letters in the corner of his mind, the thought that perhaps Germany could rise not in obedience but in memory and reflection. And as Dieter passed, he felt the subtle shift, the imperceptible change in the men that spoke louder than any command. The letters had begun to live among them, and the camp itself seemed to tremble with the tension of secrets held close to the chest. Outside, the fences, the wind cut through the early winter air, bringing whispers of the forests beyond, and the villages still standing, some untouched, some scarred by war. Dieter traced the snow with his boots, following invisible paths laid out in memory and in code. Each footprint a letter, each step a question about whether survival could extend beyond the camp, whether the voices of the men could reach ears waiting to hear the truth, and whether the network of letters would guide them safely or be discovered and silenced before the message was delivered. The men gathered near the stove, again at dusk, murmuring in corners about the fate of Germany, about what had been destroyed and what might still be saved. Elise moved among them, carrying small scraps of paper from families hidden in the villages she had risked her life for. Every note a heartbeat of hope, a proof that memory survived the rubble and the silence. She handed the notes to Dieter, who read them aloud quietly, and then memorized the sequences of words, teaching the men to understand without needing to write the letters out loud, preserving secrecy while spreading knowledge through mind and memory. One night, a distant shout echoed across the yard, the guards moving quickly to check the source, but Dieter and the others knew it was only a patrol returning. From the outskirts, they remained silent, the letters pressed to their chests, as if the paper could shield them from discovery. Every movement now calculated, every glance measured and rehearsed. The camp had become a stage of invisible messages, a theater of hidden hope where words could kill or save depending on who understood them, and Dieter realized the danger was growing, yet so was the courage. The following days passed in a strange rhythm work and labor interspersed with secret meetings and quiet readings. Dieter mapped the hidden routes and coded them in his mind, tracing them against memories of forests burned and villages spared. He shared the knowledge with a few men who had proven themselves trustworthy, and in turn they shared it with others, carefully, silently creating a network within the camp, invisible to guards, invisible to those who had once been enemies, but united now in the pulse of letters and the dream of Germany reborn. Dieter and Elise spent hours at night, whispering the contents of the letters to the men who could not read themselves, passing on knowledge that had traveled across miles of destruction to reach their hands. Each sentence repeated in code, each phrase memorized and tested for clarity. The men learned to speak in silence, in the pauses between words, in the patterns of breaths, so that a guard passing by would hear only ordinary conversation. Yet behind it lay directions and guidance. The network was alive and expanding. One afternoon, Hans confronted Dieter quietly in the yard. He spoke not with anger but with tension. The major had been watching the transformations in the men, noticing that obedience had shifted into initiative, that fear had become planning, and that memory had become power. He asked Dieter what the letters truly were, what secrets they held, and Dieter replied, not with words, but with a look, a small nod of understanding that suggested that some truths were too large for speech and had to be carried in. The major stared long and then walked away silently, as if the realization had burned itself into his consciousness. The nights grew colder, and the men huddled closer near the stoves, whispering of futures that might never come, yet holding onto the hope that they could be real. Dieter moved among them, teaching memorization of letters and codes, ensuring the network could survive, even if some were captured or silenced. He traced each pattern in the dust on the floor, drew invisible lines on the walls and ceilings, teaching the men to follow paths that existed only in memory, but were no less real for it. Every whisper, a pulse, a warning, a map to guide them through the unknown. A sudden commotion erupted one night. A guard had discovered a hidden letter, a fragment of one that had fallen unnoticed weeks ago. Panic rippled through the barracks. Dieter's heart raced as he moved to collect the pieces. The men froze in silence. The letter was returned to its place, the guard, satisfied with what he assumed was ordinary paper. But Dieter knew the truth that the network could survive only if each man remembered every detail and kept it alive inside his mind. The camp became a silent battlefield where knowledge and memory were weapons, and the letters were both shields and swords. The days stretched into weeks, and Dieter felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He walked the frozen yard, tracing the patterns of his own footsteps in the snow, imagining them as letters, guiding the men beyond the camp boundaries. He recalled the voices of children hidden in villages, the hands of mothers pressed over lips to keep secrets alive, and he understood that the letters were more than paper. They were memory, incarnate, and survival depended on them reaching the right eyes at the right moment. Carl's health declined, and Dieter spent long hours at his bedside reading aloud the letters and memorizing sequences for the men who gathered quietly nearby. They listened intently. The words became a lifeline and a code. Every syllable, a pulse of hope against the cold and the silence. The network was now a living organism moving through minds and hearts as if the camp itself had become a hidden artery, carrying the blood of memory and the essence of a Germany that might yet exist beyond defeat. One evening, Dieter stood at the fence looking out across the hills and valleys covered in frost, imagining the paths the letters might take once they left. The barracks and the men who would carry them, each path fraught with danger, yet alive with possibility. He traced the invisible lines in his mind, imagining that even under the watchful eyes of the guards, the network could continue spreading quietly, invisibly carrying knowledge and hope to those who had been waiting and dreaming in silence for months. The wind howled across the camp that night, bringing with it the sound of distant footsteps, voices he could not identify, and Dieter pressed the letters to his chest. He realized that the world outside was unaware of the network that had grown quietly in the barracks, that the voices of the men carried invisible maps and directions that could preserve memory and save lives, and that the future of Germany might depend on these whispered codes being carried faithfully beyond the fences and the walls. The following morning, the frost had melted slightly, revealing hidden paths in the yard, and Dieter traced them with his boots, imagining the letters traveling along them invisible to the eyes of the guards, the men gathered in corners, continuing to whisper codes, passing knowledge silently through patterns of speech and gesture, every movement measured, every pause deliberate, as if the world itself depended on it. And Dieter understood that the camp had transformed into a living organism where survival and hope were intertwined with memory and secrecy. And as the sun rose higher over the barracks, the men prepared for the day. They worked as though nothing had changed, yet everything had changed. The network of letters was now alive in every mind, every hand, every whispered word. Dieter felt the weight of responsibility pressing, yet also a pulse of triumph, knowing that the letters would reach those who waited, and that the dream of a Germany rebuilt on memory and courage had begun its silent journey, leaving every heartbeat heavy with suspense and the promise of what was yet to come. The dawn came pale and gray, casting long shadows across the frozen yard, and the barracks. Dieter moved among the men, carrying the letters close to his chest, his eyes scanning for any sign that the guards might notice the slightest irregularity. Every step measured, every movement deliberate, as if the ground itself were watching him, and every whisper from the men, a thread in a network too fragile to break, yet strong enough to survive the cold and the fear that surrounded them. Inside the barracks, Karl lay in his bunk, pale and shivering, yet determined. He had become the silent guide, the keeper of the letters, and Dieter spent hours at his side, tracing the lines of the hidden codes, memorizing sequences, teaching the men how to read. Without reading, how to pass knowledge, without speaking, and how to preserve hope in minds and hearts where words could not be written aloud, yet must live vividly in memory, for the future depended on it more than on anything else. The men gathered, quietly in corners, whispering the codes from memory, passing them along from one trusted ear to another, each sequence repeated and memorized like a chant or a prayer, as if the act of remembering itself would preserve the future they imagined, a Germany rebuilt not on obedience or fear, but on knowledge and courage, on truth, carried secretly in the minds of men who had survived the war and were now learning to survive peace as carefully as they had survived battle, every glance a signal, every pause a map. Outside, the frost glinted on the wire fences, as if mocking the men who had dared to imagine freedom. Dieter walked the perimeter, imagining the invisible paths the letters might take beyond the camp, imagining hands waiting in distant villages to receive them, and eyes that would read each line as if decoding the future itself. He traced the paths in his mind over hills and forests, over frozen rivers, and imagined that even if the letters were destroyed, the knowledge would survive, carried in memory from one man to another like fire passed in secret through the night. One evening, a commotion erupted at the edge of the camp. A guard had noticed a piece of paper fluttering near a barracks door. The men froze, hearts pounding. Dieter moved quickly, picking it up, pretending to adjust the wood of the building. The guard approached, suspicious, but saw nothing of note, and left the area muttering. Dieter pressed the paper to his chest, understanding that the smallest slip could unravel the network, yet feeling a surge of exhilaration, because the letters had survived the test of scrutiny, and the men had preserved them through silence and vigilance. The days passed in a strange rhythm of labor and secrecy, each movement within the barracks a careful balance between obedience and defiance, every glance a potential threat, and every whisper a lifeline. Dieter taught the men to memorize the codes, not just for reading, but for action to remember sequences in order to know where to go when the time came, when the letters could leave the camp and reach the eyes and ears who could carry them further and keep the dream of a new Germany alive. Hans watched from the shadows, silently analyzing the changes in the men around him. Once loyal only to rank and command, now listening and learning from whispered words, from letters memorized, he saw the subtle shifts in allegiance, in understanding, in courage, and for the first time he questioned the path he had followed for years. The letters had become more than paper. They were living instructions in the minds of men, and Hans realized that he had been left with a choice, to follow the network or to resist and be left behind. One night the wind screamed across the yard, rattling windows and bending fences. The men huddled near the stoves, passing along letters and codes. Dieter traced sequences in the dust on the floor, teaching the men to read in silence, to memorize in gestures and subtle nods, to follow invisible lines, drawn not on paper but in the minds of those who could survive and transmit them. The network had become a living organism that breathed quietly in the barracks and pulsed with the heartbeat of hope, even under the watchful eyes of guards unaware of what was truly alive among them. A letter arrived from a distant village, carried secretly by a man disguised as a worker, its contents hidden in plain text, ordinary words masking sequences that directed men to safe routes to hidden caches of food and tools. Dieter read the letter aloud to a small, trusted group, every word memorized, every pause, studied, every implication traced in the mind like a map. The men nodded silently, understanding that the survival of knowledge depended not on the paper but on the transmission and retention in memory and the future of Germany on this network that now spanned barracks and villages in unseen threads. The frost gave way to the first hints of spring, and the men moved with a quiet urgency. Each day, a chance to extend the network further. Each hour, a test of discipline and courage. Dieter and Elise moved among them, passing letters in silence, observing gestures, noting expressions, teaching memorization and comprehension without words. The camp itself had become a living classroom, a hidden university where the curriculum was survival memory and courage, and the grades were measured in lives preserved and hope maintained. Rumors of other camps reached the barracks, men whispered, of letters traveling from one camp to another, invisible networks carrying not just instructions, but stories of survival and courage. Dieter imagined the network expanding beyond the fences, beyond the mountains and rivers, beyond the reach of any one guard or officer. Every connection strengthening the lines of communication. Every memorized sequence, a lifeline that could reach villages and families waiting to hear from sons. Fathers and brothers lost to war, yet alive in memory and encoded. Words one afternoon. A guard discovered a note hidden beneath a floorboard. Panic rippled through the barracks. But Dieter quickly acted, moving the men away from the area and memorizing every sequence in case the letter was destroyed. The guard assumed it was worthless and left, but the men understood that every test of secrecy strengthened their resolve and reinforced the importance of memory. The network had become resilient not because it was written, but because it lived in minds and hearts, and each man carried a piece of the future within him. Nights were long and cold, and Dieter spent them teaching sequences of letters, codes, and instructions to the men who gathered silently near stoves and bunks. He traced the lines on walls in invisible patterns. He whispered sequences into the ears of men who could not read. He repeated the letters over and over until they became part of memory. Each syllable, a pulse, a heartbeat, a step toward a future. Germany built not on obedience, but on knowledge and courage, and the network grew quietly stronger with each repetition. The weeks turned to months, and the men became fluent in the codes and sequences. Dieter traced invisible maps through the barracks, through yards, through snow and mud, and imagined the paths that letters would travel once they left the camp. The men whispered quietly among themselves about the villages that would receive them, about the hands that would pass them further, and the eyes that would read them, understanding that the survival of Germany depended not on orders, but on memory, courage, and the silent network that had grown beyond paper and pen into minds and hearts. One evening, Dieter stood at the edge of the yard looking at the frost-covered horizon, imagining the network spreading through villages, forests, towns, and cities, carrying instructions, stories, and hope. The men gathered near him, silent yet attentive. He traced the invisible lines of the letters in the air as if drawing a map. The wind whispered through the fences and the trees, and Dieter felt that the future of Germany rested on this fragile but growing web, and that every heartbeat in the barracks now belonged to the network and to the hope it carried. The next morning, the camp stirred. As usual, but Dieter sensed a change in the air. The men moved with quiet determination, carrying memorized sequences in their minds. Every glance, a signal, every pause, a map, every gesture, a pulse of the network alive and breathing in the barracks. The letters had become invisible, arteries carrying knowledge, hope, and courage beyond the fences. Beyond the walls, and the future of Germany was unfolding in silence. And as the sun rose higher over the frost-covered yard, Dieter pressed the letters to his chest, knowing that every word, every sequence, every memorized line was a lifeline, a map and a guide that could survive the scrutiny of guards, the cold, the hunger, and the despair, and he understood that the network was now unstoppable, and that the men of the camp carried within them the seed of a Germany reborn, each heartbeat synchronized with the letters, each breath a step forward, and every silent whisper a promise of what was yet to come.